everyone would understand, oh yeah, a parent gets to decide if a child should go to public school or private school. No one would say the state gets to make that decision. That's kind of common sense. Well, it applies just the same that a parent should be able to decide if the child is homeschooled. But because homeschooling is much newer as a culturally identified phenomenon, we're having to work sometimes to convince the public and legislature that yes, the right to homeschool is of the same magnitude as the right to send a child to private school.
Welcome to Homeschool Talks, a podcast by HSLDA. This is a show about all things homeschooling, from practical tips to inspiring stories and everything in between. You can find show notes for this episode along with our other Homeschool Talks conversations at hslda.org/podcast. And if you want to be the first to know about new episodes as well as upcoming guests and topics, sign up for our email list using the link in the show notes. We're so glad you've joined us today, and we hope you enjoyed the program. Here's your host, Jim Mason.
Hello, I'm Jim Mason, President of Homeschool Legal Defense Association. Welcome to another edition of Homeschool Talks. Today it's my pleasure to welcome Scott Woodruff. Scott is our longest serving active attorney. Now, Mike Smith is still working part-time, but Scott has been here longer than anyone else on active duty with HSLDA's legal team. Scott is a homeschool dad and an attorney, and he recently assumed a new job title that has really been an amazing addition to the HSLDA team. He is the Director of Legal and Legislative Advocacy for HSLDA. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you, Jim.
So, Scott, I wanted to start out. We've been friends for a long time. My oldest child and your oldest child, both boys, have been friends since childhood. Tell us about your homeschool dad experience.
Oh, wow. It was awesome after I got over the hump of thinking it was a crazy, nutty, wild idea. So we built a house near our church school so our kids could walk down a nice little road and go to that nice little school. And our son Chris was in that very nice little school. And then one day, Jane came home and said, Scott, we should think about homeschooling. I said, homeschooling? We built this house, that private school. That sounds like a hippie thing. Grow your own food, weave your own clothes, teach your own kids. Don't you believe in division of labor? Yada, yada, yada. So I finally conceded to letting her try a pilot program just for the summer so she wouldn't ruin my kids' education. Fully expecting that when I came home from work, kids would be screaming, wife would be in tears, dinner would be burnt, dirty laundry would be piled in the front room. Much to my surprise, when I came home, everybody was happier. I didn't get it. And after a while, I figured out it's the Apollo 13 thing. When you're Apollo 13, you all live together or you all die together. And when you homeschool, you're on Apollo 13, and it has to work or it's all going to implode. And so the homeschool concept brings everybody together to pursue a common purpose. It unites them in a common stream. It joins their destinies in a way that sending your kids off to this school and that school doesn't. And that unification into a common destiny gives a goal and a sense of unity, common joys, common difficulties, common goals accomplished.
So you and I started out much the same way, and I'm sure many people who homeschooled for a long time and many people out there considering homeschooling as well. You didn't just decide, okay, I'm going to homeschool for life. Debbie and I, when we started, now she was convinced that homeschooling was the right thing to do for our kids. I was in the camp of, let's try it for a while and see how it works. And it wasn't maybe a year in. It really didn't take that long. I was a lot like you, where it seemed like just such a good thing that we fairly early on decided that it was our chosen lifestyle, and then it became our passion. Then it became my vocation. How did that stack up for you? Because you have a long and distinguished legal career. You were actually working in Missouri for the Attorney General John Ashcroft when you started homeschooling, right?
Right. Well, my path was not dissimilar from yours. You'll recall that when I gave the Apollo 13 analogy, I didn't say anything about, God visiting me in a dream saying I should homeschool, because it wasn't a spiritual conviction at that point. Now, as I saw that unfold, as I saw that flower kind of bloom, thought, oh, you know what? This is really nice. This really works. Gee, my kids are learning quickly. My wife feels really engaged and rewarded. She's teaching my kids to read. She loves that. My kids are like each other. My kids are staying friends. And I finally came up with this concept of one reason why it works, which is this. And to back up, when we lived in Missouri, I was, kind of still am, a yard nut. I don't let weeds grow in my yard. In Missouri, there were no dandelions in our yard. When we moved to Virginia, we rented a house for a while, and we pulled up in the driveway one day. My son, aghast, said, "Dad, there are dandelions in our lawn." I said, "No, son, they're dandelions in the landlord's lawn." So when you send your kids to school, you're kind of like a renter. And if they're dandelions, you say, they're the landlord's dandelions. But if you homeschool, you own it. You own that education program. And when you see a dandelion out there, you put stuff down, you walk out there, and you stomp that thing till it's gone. And that sense of ownership of, yeah, it's mine. Yeah, I'm responsible, tends to bring out the best in people. And I saw that principle at work in our home, and it wasn't long before I realized, you know what? This is going to be our way of life.
How many kids do you have?
We have 4.
Yeah. So there's Chris, and there's Betsy, and there's Sarah. I got it. And they're all grown up and out in the world. And then tell us about your 4th child.
Yeah, Marie was an amazing, amazing adventure. Such a joy. My wife, and by the way, just to kind of get it out, my wife has been the source of most of the biggest blessings of my life, not counting salvation, but after that, biggest source of most of my blessings. So she was inspired to try foster parenting because she knew someone that she knew that had done it, and it seemed like a really cool thing. My wife said, "Scott, elbow, elbow, don't you think we should think about fostering?" Elbow, elbow. So we went through all the training. We got fingerprinted, we got trained, we got analyzed, we got crime bureau investigation, and got approved to be foster parents for babies. So we would foster parent babies for between 1 week and 6 weeks while the process for terminating the parental rights was concluded, after which we would take them to the agency and they would hand them off to the adoptive parents. So we've foster parented 7 babies that way. Great experience. It was really a good thing. Marie was number 8. We thought she was going to be like all the others. We got her, we took care of her, but very quickly we realized she wasn't going to be like the others. She got very, very sick. Very soon she had to be life-flighted to Charlottesville because of some life-threatening conditions. She was there in the neonatal intensive care unit from October until the following June. She didn't see God's blue sky until she walked out of the hospital in our arms in June. When she left the hospital, she still had a very significant life-threatening condition. And because of that, when the adoption agency, Bethany Christian Services, made her available to their Virginia network, no one said, "Yes, I'll adopt her." So then they made her available on their nationwide network. And again, because it wasn't clear she'd lived to adulthood, no one in the nationwide network sought to adopt her. At that point, they said, well, the last thing we could do is make her available to other adoption agencies. At that point, Jane and I start looking at each other saying, oh my gosh, is it us? At that point in my life, I'm 57. Most 57-year-olds aren't taking on the responsibility of a little bitty baby. Jane was somewhat younger than I, but still, beyond typical adoption age. And to make a long story short, after a lot of prayer, a lot of seeking God, a lot of intense letting go for me, we both became convinced it was God's will for us to adopt her. Got into that pipeline, and she became ours. We're her mom and dad now.
It's an amazing story, and she's a delightful little girl. So, Scott, tell us, just how did you get from the Attorney General's office to HSLDA?
Great question. So I met Jane while I was working with John Ashcroft. And one thing led to another, and pretty soon we're engaged. We knew we're going to get married. And I'm looking at my very modest salary working for the state thinking, I don't think we can make it. We were literally looking at log cabin kits for houses to live in. And I thought, wait a second, ding, 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 ding. I could try to get a better job. So I drove around our town. There was a big insurance company there, Shelter Insurance Company. I just walked in and say, hey, I'm a lawyer. Do you have any jobs for lawyers today? Well, in fact, we do. Come on back. And it just so happened that they at that time were advertising for a job as a lawyer. So they interviewed me. They offered me the job at a pay rate that would actually allow me to care for my family reasonably well. So that's when I went to work for Shelter Insurance Companies. And then worked for them for 15 years. And while I was working for them, we began the whole homeschool journey. And of course, because all of our homeschool friends said, you have to join HSLDA. So of course we did that. And we began getting the magazine. And I would read the articles about what HSLDA would do. And I'd go, oh, that happened? The school did that to those people? HSLDA did that? And it was kind of scary, but it was kind of cool too. And then one day, Jane saw an advertisement. Scott, they're looking to hire a lawyer. I looked at it. I'm not the kind of lawyer they want. Jane said, Scott, you should apply. I said, okay. So I applied. And after a while, God just kind of pricked me to say, Scott, don't just apply in this desultory, toss it and let it go. Really labor for this. And something changed in my heart, and I began sending in extra letters of recommendation. I sent in a letter of recommendation from John Ashcroft. I heard later that with that letter, my resume went from the big stack of throw these away to the small stack of consider these people further. And further process went on. I had to submit, we had to do like a writing test, an essay, and then interviews on the phone and interviews in person, and was then offered the job in September of 1998.
So you've been here since 1998. You came to work here as a contact lawyer, helping people in a bunch of states. And since 1998, you've seen a lot of things come and go and some changes. And here you are today as our Director of Legal and Legislative Advocacy. Give us some reflections on those many years of service here, as well as, start telling us about what you're doing today.
Well, it's been an amazing 24 years. We've grown from, I'm not sure how many full-time employees we had back then. I'm sure it was under 50. There was just seedlings of departments. For example, in 98, we didn't have an accounting department. We had Mike Smith, and he did it all. I think Suzanne Stevens worked for us, but it was like her and maybe one guy. Sherry Wilson came to work shortly after that. So there were tiny buds of departments, but they were minuscule. And then as God continued to bless HSLDA and grow, we added staff to kind of fill out those functions and be able to do that, in a more, Wharton-like manner. We added more attorneys. Technology changed. The internet was born during that era. For example, when I worked at the insurance company, I remember a big controversy over whether we should get fax machines. And, the senior leadership said, fax machines, they're just silly, frivolous toys. Nobody's going to use those things. Well, then garage mechanics began faxing us estimates for cars. All right, I guess we better get fax machines. But around that time, the internet also came in with that whole revolution, and the revolution of doing so much work on laptops, desktops. And as HSLDA has incorporated those technologies, those have improved our efficiencies, which have really allowed us to keep the cost to members down. And we currently have one system I think is wonderful called Nimble that has improved my efficiency and my ability to help families with a really quick turnaround time.
So we are here in as we speak, we're in early March, and HSLDA goes through seasons every year. We are in the middle of our state legislative season, which is a big part of what you are overseeing today. Walk us through what the legislative season is like in a typical year, and then we'll focus a little bit more on today.
Well, first of all, why is there a season at all? That's because most state legislatures only meet for a few months of the year. Now, there are some exceptions like Illinois, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. Some states essentially meet all year round like the federal government. But most states meet for between 6 weeks and 3 months. And almost always they start their session around January, and they'll go until, say early March, April, maybe May. So there really truly is a season when legislation at a state level becomes very, very active. And we're in the middle of that right now. So in a typical legislative season, we are looking at a variety of bills that could impact homeschooling. We're deciding which bills should we oppose, which bills should we support, which bills can we just not take any position on.
How do we, tell our listeners, how does HSLDA keep track of, in any given legislative season, maybe 150,000 bills will be introduced across the country? How do we keep track of the ones that, how do we identify and keep track of the ones that are of interest to homeschoolers?
Great question, Jim. We have a contract service with an organization that has a program that scans every bill filed in every state. And based on our instructions, that organization looks for certain words or phrases. And if they detect that word or phrase that we've told them to look for, they immediately send that bill to us for review. Once it comes to us, we go through a scanning process to kind of quickly see, okay, this bill is one we obviously need to oppose. Oh, this is one that we don't need to take any position on. And then we kind of triage those and decide what action needs to be taken.
So we have more attorneys than you and I here at HSLDA. How do you manage all of the attorneys in keeping track of all of those bills?
Right. So each attorney is responsible for their own states. So the principal way we organize the attorneys in the department is the attorneys are responsible for a group of states. So if an attorney, for example, is responsible for Missouri, as I am, I help Missouri families during the year if they have questions about the homeschool law or if they have conflicts with Missouri local officials. I also take responsibility for Missouri bills. And so when our system begins telling us that Missouri bills are being filed, I review those. And each attorney does the same. They review the bills that are popping up in their own states.
So let's assume that you've reviewed a bill and you've decided that you want to keep track of it because it's a bad bill. What are some ways that we approach handling bad bills?
Jim, almost the very first thing I will always do is contact the state organization that we partner with. Because while we have a very vigorous legislative ministry, we're not doing this alone. We're doing this in close partnership with the state organization. So I will identify a bill that I think we should oppose, and I will email, call, text them and say, hey, Brad, there's a bad bill about to be filed. Would your organization join HSLDA in opposing this? Brad, is there anything that you see that I've missed? And we'll talk about it and come to a consensus.
And you say Brad as if you know Brad. I mean, how important is it for us as kind of here in Virginia to have those kind of really close relationships out in the States?
It's very important because when there's a legislative emergency, we don't have time to go out and say, hey, how are you? I'm Scott Woodruff. We need a relationship that's already established. And a healthy relationship can stand the pressure of a legislative battle. A relationship that doesn't exist is not going to help that out. So we make special efforts to keep good relationships with leaders in state organizations. So when the big fight comes, that relationship can be an asset for us in that battle.
Yeah, and I just want to point out here that many of the state organizations have been around about the same amount of time as HSLDA. So we're in our 40th year. We're just about ready to celebrate our 40th anniversary, as are some of the state organizations out there. And many of the state organizations have somebody, working with them or for them whose focus is on Capitol Hill in their state, keeping relationships with legislators and tracking bills and working with us to oppose or support bills. So it's a very synergistic, team-oriented approach that we take and that Scott's now supervising on our behalf. So what are some approaches, for opposing bad bills? So I know, we don't always just turn on the fire hose and try to decimate a bad bill. So from a very modest approach to a legislative emergency, call out the fire wagon approach, how do you manage those kind of situations?
Right. We do have a scaled response. The first response would be that we would create what I call a bill page on our legislative advocacy section of our website. We would simply identify the bill. We would say that we oppose it, and we would say why we oppose it. In some contexts, the mere fact that HSLDA opposes a bill carries a huge amount of weight, because at that point, people will start saying, oh, HSLDA is against that bill. And people often look to us for leadership on these issues. And so the fact that we have taken a public position against a bill has its own weight. Now, if the bill continues to move forward, then we may contact members of the committee that is going to have a hearing on the bill. We may contact the sponsor. For example, yesterday, I sent a letter to a Pennsylvania lawmaker about a bill she's about to introduce. And it was an ESA bill.
What's an ESA?
It stands for Education Savings Account. It sounds like something really nice and lovely. It's really the name for a way to channel government money into private taxpayer homes. And we are very robustly against those.
For private homeschoolers.
Right. We're not opposed to those if the money is not going to be available to homeschool families. But if it is, then we're going to oppose it. So in the letter I sent to Senator Ward yesterday, I said, hi, I'm Scott Woodruff. I understand you're thinking about filing an ESA bill this year. I'd like you to know that if the money is available for homeschool families, we will oppose it. Please draft it so it is not available for homeschool families.
Now, there's a lot of history and principles and thought that has gone into why HSLDA opposes taxpayer funding for private homeschooling. And we have available a pamphlet that it had its origin in life as a speech that I gave at our national conference at the Museum of the Bible in 2018. It's become a court report cover story, and it's now available in pamphlet form. And it'll be available as a link in our show notes that our producers will make sure that those of you who have further questions about why we oppose tax money for private homeschooling, you can learn more there. So Scott, you mentioned this sort of graduated approach. I mean, sometimes bills that if they were adopted would be very harmful to homeschooling, we learn early on just really have no chance of passing. And so we don't, we may make a bill page, but we don't really do much else. And that's because we have really good intelligence on the ground with those legislative committees. And But when a bill that we oppose, let's say that somebody wants to really clamp down on homeschooling. They want to impose new regulations on homeschooling, and it looks like it's got legs. Then what do we do?
Then we send a bulletin to our members and friends asking them to contact the lawmakers and express their wish that they would vote against that bill. For example, we sent out, we call this an e-alert. So most people would call it a bulletin or a message to urge action. We call it an e-alert. We sent out an e-alert yesterday morning in Missouri to 7,700 people. Those are members and friends, urging them to call lawmakers to oppose an ESA bill there, Senate Bill 255. And so with over 7,000 people getting that request for action, lawmakers are going to be hearing from their constituents. And honestly, Jim, HSLDA doesn't have many levers here. Nobody listens to Scott Woodruff because I'm Scott Woodruff. But if a lawmaker has gotten 100 phone calls opposing a bill, and then I call that lawmaker, now the lawmaker listens, not because he cares about Scott Woodruff, but because he knows his constituents know about this and they're going to hold him accountable for it.
Now, the other side of this is sometimes, homeschool bills, homeschool laws have been around for a long time. Some of them are really antiquated, and we do a lot of work to try to improve the homeschool laws in the various states. How does that process work? And I just want to say right here that I've watched Scott over the years in some of the states that he's overlooked, and I live in Virginia, and so I really care about Virginia. And Scott, along with our state organization, the Home Educating Association of Virginia, which we don't use the acronym, HEAB, which is the first syllable of heaven. But anyway, Scott and the HAAB partners here in Virginia have pretty often adopted improvements to the homeschool law here in Virginia. How do you do that?
First, let me say that stopping a bill is much easier than getting a bill through the legislature. To stop a bill, you only need one win. If a bill dies in committee once, it's dead. Boom, you're done. To get a bill through, you have 5 battles: House committee, House floor, Senate committee, Senate floor, governor. For example, when I was working on the parental-rights statute in Virginia, I made 9 trips to Richmond. That takes a lot of time, a lot of effort. So how do we do it? Maybe the best way is to get a bill and a setup where it's actually not controversial. So perhaps the idea has already been battered around. Perhaps a state organization has already contacted key lawmakers on the committee. Perhaps they know it's going to be supported without much of a controversy. File the bill. We may not need to send out a bulletin at all. Committee adopts it. It goes to the floor. The floor knows that it was warmly welcomed in committee. The House passes it. Goes to Senate with those recommendations. We have gotten a number of bills through without seeking a single e-alert.
So I'm going to be cryptic here. There is a state in these 50 United States right now where that is actually happening. And because I have had cases in that state over the years, and other of our attorneys have had cases, and there's been a lot of friction over the years because of the antiquated homeschool law that exists there. And we have allies from unexpected quarters now trying to remove the friction from not just the homeschooler's perspective, but from the state perspective. And the bill is, widely supported and widely expected to kind of sail through without us doing much. But I just want to point out that a lot of the reason for that is because of a lot of the things that we've done over the years that have led to a more or less universal understanding that this antiquated bill that, was passed before email existed, needs to be modernized. And that's what you're talking about. So let's talk about today. How many bills are we tracking currently today?
I don't have an actual accurate number. I am going to kind of spitball and say that we started off by looking at 3,500 bills. And that's about the number of bills that we reviewed to see if we wanted to keep track of that, monitor it, watch it.
Mm-hmm. And how many of those do you think have been winnowed out by early March?
Many.
Many. Many. Is that more than few? And here we are in the beginning of March, and I know, the Alabama legislature just opened. And, so we're still kind of in the throes of things. What's the typical wind down for our legislative season? How does that end up?
So the most intense part is January, February, March. Virginia, for example, begins to have legislative hearings in early January. So lawmakers tend to pre-file bills in December. And when the legislature opens, they take those pre-filed bills, begin setting them for hearings. So I've attended hearings in Virginia in early January. January, February, March are really busy. Usually sometime in March or April, they come to what's called in various states the funnel date or the crossover date. By that I mean the date by which a bill must have successfully passed out of one house for it to receive the attention of the second house. For example, if a bill is filed in the House, it has to be through the House by, say, March 1st, or the Senate won't give it any consideration. So there's usually a last-minute rush as that funnel date or crossover date approaches. But after that date, things slow down a bit because there are fewer bills moving forward. So that's kind of the first break in the tempo. And then as things go on, certain bills die, that narrows the field. And by the time we get to late April, early May, it's down to just a handful of bills that we're still having to fight vigorously.
So, Scott, tell our listeners, what kind of bills do we typically keep a watch for that, obviously those that involve homeschooling directly, but we have a range of other issues that we kind of keep track of as well.
So homeschool statute directly is obviously our number one priority. We also keep track of bills that would subject kids to compulsory attendance age for a longer period of their lives. For example, if a bill would move the start age for compulsory attendance from 6 to 5, we're going to oppose that. If it's going to raise it from 17 to 18, we're going to oppose that. We generally favor Religious Freedom Restoration Act bills. And by that I mean bills that say the freedom to exercise one's religion is a fundamental right and can only be infringed by the government if they're using the least restrictive method and they have a compelling interest. Those are kind of near and dear to our heart because for many families, homeschooling is an expression of their faith.
Yeah, and that one of those bills that we supported years ago in Pennsylvania, actually, you worked on a situation just recently.
Right. That's a fantastic example. So in Pennsylvania, the law is that you can't homeschool unless you have a high school diploma or GED. That's an antiquated provision. It's not justified by research, but it's the law. We encountered a family where one spouse had a diploma, the other didn't. The spouse who had the diploma died. It came time to file new paperwork, and the spouse without the diploma couldn't honestly swear that they had the diploma. And so the spouse asked us for help. I immediately engaged on the Religious Freedom Restoration Act law, and the argument is very simply this. The family had been homeschooling for years. The kids always made excellent progress. It was a successful homeschool program. The parent who did most of the teaching was the parent without the diploma. So the fact that the parent with the diploma died had relatively little impact on the homeschool program per se. Obviously, it impacted the family in a devastating way, but in terms of the educational program, it wasn't a total disruption. And so our argument was, this family is homeschooling because of religious reasons. This is their conviction. It's not just a good idea to them. This is their conviction. This is who they are. They would do anything rather than give up homeschooling and put their kids in a public school. So we said, this is clearly a fundamental interest in exercising their right. Does the state have a compelling reason to overcome that and make them put their kids in public school? Our argument was no, because the family has a successful track record of educating their kids. They don't need to be in public school. It should be allowed to continue. So we drafted a letter to the local school board saying, please make an exception and allow this family to keep homeschooling, even though they have no diploma or GED. And we cited the Pennsylvania RAFRA statute. And initially, the school board said, nope, we're not making an exception. Kids have to go to public school.
And that's when you called on Peter Kamakavivole, who is one of our other attorneys.
That's when we sent a sterner letter saying, if you don't grant her a letter, we are going to feel compelled to take this to court. And by the way, here is a rough draft of our lawsuit. We'd love to hear from you. And they wrote back and said, okay, we'll put off taking any action for now.
Yeah. So the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, there's a federal Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And in Pennsylvania, it was actually called the Religious Freedom Protection Act. And we've used that over the years many times. We had a season a few years ago when I was actively doing our litigation work where we had dozens of cases invoking that act. What other kind of bills do we support? You mentioned the Virginia Fundamental Parental Rights Statute. What year was that?
Whoa, that was several years ago.
2013.
Thank you.
Just in case you're wondering.
Seems like only yesterday.
Yeah. So you have, you sort of developed a subspecialty. We have a sister organization called the Parental Rights Foundation. And the Parental Rights Foundation and related organizations are trying to get fundamental parental rights statutes as well as a federal constitutional amendment. And over the years, you have gone out and testified on behalf of those statutes in how many states?
In 4 states.
4 states. I think we have 13 states now that have parental rights statutes passed. Virginia may have been, it was one of the first ones for sure. Tell us a little bit about your experience getting, working on that and getting that bill passed in Virginia.
Right. So of the 4 states in which I testified, 3, the bills became law, which is really amazing. And I got to where I could address the issues pretty comfortably. There are always lots of questions. They always tended to be controversial. But in Nevada, Idaho, Virginia, the legislatures got the message and enacted it. In Maine, the bill died in committee. Now, you asked me to give you kind of some details on that. So in Virginia, there was a whole lot of discussion in committees about the exact wording of the bill.
Before we go into the exact wording of the bill, Scott, let me just interrupt you. Why do homeschoolers care about parental rights?
They care because the right of a parent to direct their child's education, well-being, care, education is part of that. Education comes under what a parent does for a child. Everyone would understand, oh yeah, a parent gets to decide if a child should go to public school or private school. No one would say the state gets to make that decision. That's kind of common sense. Well, it applies just the same that a parent should be able to decide if the child is homeschooled. But because homeschooling is much newer as a culturally identified phenomenon, we're having to work sometimes to convince the public and legislature that yes, the right to homeschool is of the same magnitude as the right to send a child to private school.
And going back to the Religious Freedom Acts, when I first came to work at HSLDA, I was told that two of the principal protections and safeguards for homeschool freedom are parental rights and religious freedom, because so many people homeschool as parents for religious reasons. So that's why our focus goes beyond just the homeschool laws. So 2013, the Fundamental Parental Rights Bill passed in Virginia. So I just want to tell a quick story here. Many of our listeners may have followed the election for governor in our Commonwealth of Virginia. What was that? 2021. And we, he famously had a debate with former Governor Terry McAuliffe, in which Terry McAuliffe said the part out loud that they're not supposed to say, which was that he didn't think parents had any business interfering or any I can't remember his exact words, but parents have no business interfering with how public schools educate their children. And so his opponent, Glenn Youngkin, who's now our governor, rode that. I mean, his poll numbers, took a really strong north turn immediately after that debate, because he took the opposite position, believing that parents do have fundamental rights in education and even within the public schools. So I had the privilege of interviewing candidate Youngkin for one of the other divisions that we have here, where we actually work on behalf of candidates. And so before we could decide whether we would work on his behalf, we send a questionnaire, but his campaign wouldn't do questionnaires. They just had a matter of principle, wouldn't answer questionnaires. So I said, well, will he sit for an interview? So his campaign agreed, and Glenn Youngkin, between campaign stops on a Zoom call on his iPhone in his car, sat for an interview with me. And I mentioned this debate and how important, homeschoolers think parental rights are. And he said, yes, and I agree with you. And by the way, did you know that in Virginia, there was a statute that was passed in 2013 that says parents have a fundamental right to direct the care, upbringing, and education of their children? And I said, why? Yes, I did know that. and so the rest is history. He went on to victory. Well, Scott, what else would you like to tell our listeners about your role here, or what you think is important for them to know with our legislative work?
Well, quick update. We talked about RAFRA statutes. The West Virginia legislature has now passed a RAFRA statute, and that will now head to the governor's desk. We're pretty sure that he will sign that. In West Virginia, it's also a system where you must have a high school diploma or GED. And so we think that could help in a situation where a family is homeschooling because of religious convictions, and they bump into a scenario where neither parent has a diploma. You talked about the two pillars of protecting homeschool freedom, the parental rights and religious liberty. That was illustrated most dramatically in the DeYoung case in Michigan in about 1993. Maybe our most important case ever, in my opinion. At that time, Michigan had a law that said you can't homeschool unless you have a teacher certificate, which eliminated virtually everyone. We filed a lawsuit to challenge that. There were actually two lawsuits. One involved a family who was homeschooling because of a religious conviction. The other had a strong conviction to homeschool, but it wasn't religious. Both cases went to the Michigan Supreme Court. There were 5 members on the Michigan Supreme Court. With respect to the family who had a religious conviction, they won 3-2. With respect to the family who didn't have a religious conviction, they lost 2-3. So that's a fantastic illustration of why it's important that we provide a robust protection both to religious freedom and parental rights.
And I just want to point out in that case, because that is one of the more interesting cases that HSLDA has ever worked on, and it was before either you or I were here. So the family, both families actually homeschooled for religious reasons. The one family raised it in their original defense as they were being prosecuted, and the other only raised parental rights in their original case. And so on appeal, they could only argue the things that they'd raised in the court below. But here's the thing. The family that lost 3-2 on that issue actually won, because in the earlier stages of the trial, the prosecutors made a procedural error. And so the court actually, both families ended up being able to homeschool. And what was even more important was because those families stood in the gap and HSLDA came alongside and litigated that issue, all of the other families in Michigan that lacked teacher certificates, all those cases were put on hold for years while that case made its way all the way up to the state Supreme Court. And then immediately after the state Supreme Court ruled, the Michigan legislature changed the law. And so that's why you and I do what we do every day, I think.
And they changed the law in a very accommodating manner, so that today Michigan has a really good homeschool law. And by good, I mean there's not wasteful red tape. There are important principles, but there's not red tape families have to fill out and file.
Yeah, and that's something that we continually look at, is how can we modernize homeschooling statutes that take into account all of the things that we know about homeschooling today, the research that shows that homeschooling kids are doing fine, and that homeschooling parents, you don't have to have a PhD to be a homeschool parent. Every legislative season and with your leadership, I expect that we're going to continue to be improving many homeschooling laws throughout the country. Last word to you, Scott.
Right. So if someone wants to receive legislative bulletins from us, they have to opt in. So if you're just a member and haven't opted in, you're not going to get a bulletin. You can participate as a friend and opt in also, but you can go to your member preferences and make sure you check the box to receive those bulletins. Otherwise, you're just not going to get it. We only want to send bulletins to people who want to receive them. But people responding to those bulletins can be tremendously influential.
Yeah. I just want one thing I meant to mention in the kind of when we're doing legislative work, sometimes we've actually asked homeschool families to show up for legislative hearings as well. You've been involved in some of those. I know we were sort of on the ready to sign off, but talk about some of those and how effective it is when families show up at legislative hearings.
Sure, and I'll give you a very recent example. And I'll also say that homeschool freedom is a bipartisan issue. I have seen Republican governors veto good homeschool bills. I've seen Democratic governors sign good homeschool bills. And so I never take the mindset that, it's just one party that cares about this issue, because freedom resonates in both parties, maybe different segments of the parties, but freedom is just as valuable to people who you might say fall on the right hand end of the spectrum as to those who fall on the left hand end of the spectrum. There is a significant part of the homeschool population that would identify as strongly leftward. They love their freedom. They don't want their freedom encroached on, and they will go to bat to protect that freedom if there's a threat. In Minnesota, which is democratically controlled right now, a bill was recently filed that would have made the homeschool laws worse. It would have said that for a year-end assessment, you have to administer the test in a way the superintendent tells you, and the burden of proof is on you to show that you did it the way the superintendent wanted. What a red tape nightmare. What an absolute mess. And there was no problem it was trying to solve. They just thought, yeah, I think it'd be a good idea to do this. So that was introduced into a bill. We began fighting it. We asked families to make calls. We asked families to go there. Some families went to the committee, met committee members. We got feedback from a key committee member that went something like this. Oh, these people are nice. I didn't realize that this would hurt those people. I'm going to withdraw my support. And that threat is now over.
Yeah, and that's time and time again. Often the best advocate for homeschool freedom in our state houses all across the country is the mom and dad and their kids making a visit to their representatives. We've seen it over and over and over again. So my guest today has been Scott Woodruff, our HSLDA Director of Legal and Legislative Advocacy, and our most seasoned and experienced attorney here. Thank you, Scott, for all of your years of service and wisdom in helping us keep homeschooling free. I'd like to remind all you listeners, if you'd like to support the work that we do, you can come to our website, hslda.org. You can join up. You can sign up for legislative alerts, our weekly update newsletters, and all kinds of good things there. We have an awful lot of information that can help you if you're thinking about homeschooling or getting started homeschooling, moving to a new state, all kinds of good stuff. So thank you once again, Scott, for joining me today. And this is Jim Mason. I am Jim Mason, actually, and the president of Homeschool Legal Defense Association. And this has been another episode of Homeschool Talks.
Today's program is made possible by HSLDA's legal support team. We know homeschooling isn't always easy. That's why we're committed to giving you peace of mind, so you can focus on giving your kids the best possible education. As an HSLDA member, you have access to customized legal advice from our team of attorneys to help you comply with your state's homeschool law, and will represent you if your right to homeschool is ever challenged, even in court. Every day, we help our members respond to overreaching officials, and we stand ready to defend your homeschool against unlawful attacks. To hear more about how you can enjoy a worry-free homeschool experience, visit hslda.org/join. That's hslda.org/join. Thanks for listening to this episode of Homeschool Talks. If you've enjoyed this conversation, will you do us a favor by sharing it with a friend or leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts? As a reminder, you can find show notes for this episode along with our other Homeschool Talks conversations at hslda.org/podcast. And if you want to be the first to know about new episodes, as well as upcoming guests and topics, you can sign up for our email list using the link in the show notes. That's all for now. We hope you enjoyed this program, and we'll see you next time.